Hi everyone. This lecture is going to continue our conversations about experimental design, making it a bit more complicated, a bit more advanced. We're going to look at how to understand factors and levels in experimental design, and also understanding the disadvantages of between subjects versus within subjects designs. So the material we're going over in this online lecture, and actually for the next few weeks, both in person and online, we're going to be talking about various aspects of experimental methods. So there's an assigned reading that you have this week. It's a textbook chapter from a methods book, the textbook that I actually use in my methods research class. Just one chapter that we're going to be reading from that book this semester on experiments and threats to validity. We're going to keep revisiting this chapter throughout the next few weeks because we're going to be touching on different aspects of experimental design and really digging in how to conduct stronger, more convincing kinds of experiments. So you should read that chapter this week, but do know that we'll be addressing various aspects of it over the next few weeks. And so you might want to keep revisiting this chapter as we go over new topics. Especially you'll want to revisit this chapter before we take the first exam of the class. Just because I think it'll be useful to read before we've covered all this material and then revisit it after we've covered it so you can kind of reinforce some of this information. So just some tips and tricks here for how to approach reading and using this chapter for this first half of the course. So far, what we've talked about with experiments are really just the basic features of experimental design. And those features include, first, that we're manipulating the independent variable. So we're not just kind of asking people how often they use some kind of media, how often they scroll social media, how often they watch TV shows, how often they see certain kinds of movies. Instead, we're actually creating a situation where we're assigning people to engage with media in some particular way. And in doing so, we're going to create treatment groups and we're going to create control or comparison groups. Those treatment groups reflecting the kind of media that we're really interested in understanding the effects of, such as a violent piece of media, and those controller comparison groups functioning as some kind of alternate version of that media that we're interested in. So if we're studying our treatment as violent media, our controller comparison might be non-violent media, or in some cases it might even be a non-media activity. So maybe you're sitting around doing nothing for 10 minutes, maybe you're drawing, maybe you're reading a book. So in that case, some kind of non-digital media. But we're going to have at least one treatment group, at least one control group, sometimes multiple treatment groups, sometimes multiple control groups. And importantly, the participants that are coming in to be in our study are not choosing which media that they engage with. We are actually randomly assigning them to engage with this media or that media. So participant first comes into my study, I flip a coin, heads they go to violent media, tails they go to non-violent media. Next participant comes in, I do the same thing. So it's not up to me which one they're choosing, it's not up to the participant which one they're choosing, it's up to random chance. And the goal here, the reason we're doing this, is to ensure group equivalence at the start of the study. So I know that I can assume, at least, that the group of participants who has watched my violent media are pretty similar across the board as those who have watched my non-violent media. There's the same amount of men and women in each group. There's the same amount of high aggressive people and low aggressive people in each group. All of these kinds of individual differences that I might care about are equally distributed across the two groups. And so that brings us to factors and levels. So we're going to kind of complicate this basic experimental design that I presented on the last slide by looking at how we can kind of answer multiple questions with just one experimental design. So how can we kind of build in multiple points of interest, multiple hypotheses that we can test simultaneously? And so a factor is going to refer to each independent variable that is manipulated in an experiment, and a level is going to be a specific group or condition of each factor. The important thing is that each experimental design that I have can be summarized or referred to based on its number of factors and levels. And so I want to show you what that looks like with some examples. So let's take this hypothesis that playing violent media will increase aggression, and our comparison point being watching violent media. So I think that playing violent media versus watching violent media will increase aggression. In other words, those who play violent media will be more aggressive than those who watch violent media. And we can take two examples. So let's imagine that I have participants coming in and they're going to be engaging with Spider-Man content. They're either going to watch an excerpt from a Spider-Man movie or they're going to play an excerpt from a Spider-Man video game. And I might be picking kind of highly violent sections here. So action-packed fist fighting, blood and gore, whatever it might be. I'm going to pick some segments that reflect kind of the material that I'm interested in this case, violent content. So I might have them come in. I'm going to randomly assign them to either watch violent media or play violent media. And then afterward, I might assess their level of aggression. So I wouldn't actually be able to use this version of a measure in a study. But let's say for just the purpose of explanation or purpose of an example, that I'm going to have you watch violent media or play violent media, and then I'm going to see how many electric shocks you give to another participant that's in the study. So I want to know, do you give them 5 shocks? Do you give them 10 shocks? Do you give them 15 shocks? How aggressive of a shock do you give them? Ethically, we could not actually create a study where you're going to electric shock somebody, but just for the sake of imagining what an aggressive outcome could look like, let's say electric shocks. We'll look at some examples in future weeks about how we actually try to approximate this behavior in the lab. But for now, randomly assigning to watching or playing violent media, and I want to see how many electric shocks you give to somebody after that experience. So in this case, the factor in my study, so the independent variable I have manipulated, is the type of media, and it's going to have 2 levels. I'm either having you watching a violent movie or I have you playing a violent game. And so in this case, the experiment, if I wanted to summarize it, has just one factor with 2 levels. One independent variable with a treatment group and a comparison group, a watching versus playing. And I think in this case that playing versus watching is going to lead to higher aggression. It's going to lead to more electric shocks. So one experiment, or in this experiment, one factor with just 2 levels. Now, the interesting thing we can do with an experimental design is that we can build in multiple different independent variables and ask slightly more complicated questions. So let's imagine I add another hypothesis here and say, I think playing violent media with other people versus alone is going to lead to higher aggression. It's going to increase aggression. So in this case, I might imagine a scenario where I have people coming into my lab, I'm randomly assigning them to watch violent media or play violent media. And within each of those groups, I'm further assigning them to watch alone or to watch with others, to play alone or to play with others. So I actually have 4 groups here, which I've manipulated what kind of media you're engaging with and whether you're doing it alone or with others. And afterward, again, I'm going to see how many electric shocks you give to another person in the study. So in which of these groups are you exhibiting the highest aggression? In which of these groups are you exhibiting lower aggression? So I've made my design a bit more complicated, and so I'd summarize it this way. First, I have my first factor, which is type of media, same one we had before, watching violent movies or playing violent video games. And then I have factor 2, which is context, so the media exposure context. Was it alone or was it with others? Leading to 4 groups. And so in this case, I would have what we call a 2-by-2 experiment. I have 2 factors. Factor 1 has 2 levels, and factor 2 has 2 levels. I have factor 1, type of media, watching or playing, and I have factor 2, media context, alone or with others, leading to 4 total groups. And I'm going to see which group is highest and which one is lowest in amount of aggression. The other thing to note with factors in experimental designs is that we can have both between subjects factors or within subjects factors. So a between subjects factor means that participants are assigned to only one level of each factor. And participants at one level are then compared to those at another level. So let's take, for example, what we were just looking at. In those examples, I was randomly assigning participants to play or watch. So you weren't doing both of these things, you were doing just one. And you were doing those activities alone or together. You weren't doing it alone and then together or together and then alone. You were playing or watching and you were alone or together. So I had these 4 total groups and you were assigned to only one of those 4 groups. Within each factor, I had 2 levels. and you are assigned only one level of each of those factors. So between subjects means that you're doing only one thing in my study, and I'm comparing you to those other people in my study who had some other kind of experience, a different kind of comparison experience. Contrast this with within subjects factors, which means that participants are assigned to multiple levels of a factor, oftentimes every level of a factor, but it doesn't always have to be every level. And in these examples, or in these studies, we have participants are compared to themselves over time or under different experimental conditions. So for example, we didn't look at this quite yet, but I'll show you some on the next slide. We might see what you're like before and then after media exposure. So how aggressive are you before you've watched something, and then how aggressive are you after? And I want to see if you increase or decrease in your level of aggression. Or I might have you do multiple different kinds of media experiences. I might have you play something and then watch something, and after each of those experiences, I want to see how aggressive you behave. So again, in this case, I'm not comparing you to other people, but I'm comparing you to yourself over time or under different conditions. And I'm able to do that because I've assigned you to multiple levels of a factor. So let's look at some examples here of a within subjects design. So let's look at first what it means to compare you over time. So I could have these same two media conditions, watching violent media or playing violent media. Again, here, factor one is type of media, and the levels are watching or playing. And I might keep this as a between subjects factor. I might randomly assign you to watch, and I might randomly assign you to play. You're only going to do one of these activities. But I can then blend this with a within subjects factor, and I can look at what happens when I compare you over time, before and after you've watched media. So in this case, I now have a second factor of time, which is a within subjects factor, and I'm seeing what you're like before and what you're like after. So in this case, I still have a 2x2 experiment, but in this case, I have one factor that's between subjects. Which kind of media experience did you have? And my other factor is within subjects. What were you like before and what were you like after the media experience? And this is a pretty classic kind of experimental design. It's called a pre-test, post-test design is what you'll sometimes see it referred to as. And it's somewhat, I'd say, one of the most common kinds of experimental designs. And the benefit is that I'm not just seeing what you're like after you have a media experience, but I can sort of see where everybody started, and then I can look to see if there's change over time within subjects, rather than just looking at these between subjects differences at the end of the study. So it complicates my experiment a bit, but it allows me to ask and answer multiple different kinds of questions, test multiple different kinds of hypotheses here. And we can keep making it even more complicated. So taking the examples we had before, let's say I still have my between subjects factor of type of media, watching or playing. And let's bring back again my other between subjects factor of exposure context. Are you watching alone? Are you playing alone? Are you watching with others? Are you playing with others? And I can build in another factor of time within subjects. What are you like before and what are you like after each of these experiences? So I still have my 4 groups, but I'm not just looking at what everybody is like after their media experience, but I'm first going to see what they're like before. And then for each of these 4 groups, I can look at change over time, before versus after the media experience. And so again, I've added another layer of complexity. I've added another factor. And in this case, I'm going to end up with a 2x2x2 experiment. I have 3 factors, each with 2 levels. And we would still call this a pre-test, post-test design. Relative to the previous slide, I have just added another between subjects factor. So I've created additional groups, but each of those groups are being tested twice within subjects before and then after. So a 2x2x2. So those were all examples of, again, what we call a pre-test, post-test design. But there is a slightly different approach I could take, which is rather than see what you're like before and after media, I could see what you're like after 2 different media experiences. So I'm not looking to see how you change over time, but in this case, I'm looking to see how you change under different kinds of media conditions. So I could have you watch violent media and see how many electric shocks you give someone, and then I could have you play violent media and see how many electric shocks you give someone. So in this case, I would have just one factor in my study. It would be a within subjects factor because you are doing both of these activities in the context of my study. You're going to watch and then you're going to play. And I'm going to see how aggressive you are under these different conditions. And so echoing that very first design I showed you, again, this experiment has just one factor with two levels. Rather than between subjects, it is now within subjects. With that kind of design in mind, you can probably start to think through what some of the advantages and what some of the disadvantages are of having a within subjects design. In many cases, these disadvantages are really what I want to emphasize here. But you might say, well, why would you pick a within subjects design in the first place? The main reason, and this is more of a statistical reason, but I think it's important to just know, is that it usually requires fewer participants than a between subjects design. Since I'm looking at how you change under different conditions, I can be pretty certain in the context of those designs that the conditions that I put you under are the things that changed your behavior if I'm sort of seeing differences under these different conditions. Unlike when I'm assigning, different people to different kinds of experiences, there are more sorts of alternative explanations I might be able to come up with to account for why one group looks different than the other. Some of those alternative explanations are taken away when I'm just comparing you under different conditions over time. So I'm generally going to need smaller sample sizes when I have these within subjects designs. And also, more importantly, some of these within subjects designs might reflect and capture how real-world media experiences actually tend to unfold. So you can imagine when you're sitting around watching television, watching streaming services, scrolling TikTok, scrolling Instagram, you're not often just engaging with one single message by itself. You're often engaging with these messages in sequences and watching multiple different things in a row, or watching and then playing something and so forth. And so we can think about these within subjects designs potentially capturing and reflecting what real world experiences tend to look like a little better. That's not going to be the case in all contexts, but that could be one potential benefit. But there are also going to be some disadvantages here. The first key one that I want to note is what we call demand characteristics. These are going to be cues that lead participants to guess the hypothesis of an experiment and change their behavior accordingly. So just the sheer fact that I have kind of put you under these different conditions and measured your aggression multiple times, you might start to kind of guess like, oh, they're showing me a violent thing, I'm playing a violent thing, and they're seeing how aggressive I am each time. Particularly once you've taken a research methods class, you might start to be able to infer or guess what the researcher is interested in looking for in those studies. And the concern with that is that you might then change your behavior. If you're like, oh, they're seeing if violence leads me to be aggressive. If violence leads me to be more aggressive, you might decide to be more aggressive. Alternatively, you might decide to be less aggressive. You might sort of react and say, well, I'm not going to show them what they want to see. I'm going to do the opposite. So you could sort of imagining it going either way, but in both cases, that's going to be a demand characteristic where you're guessing or inferring the purpose of the study, and then you're changing your behavior either to match that or to go against that. And then the other thing is what we would call an order effect. And this is going to be when participants change how they respond to a media stimulus based on the sequence in which they've experienced those different stimuli. So part of this could be that I've just given you the same set of questions and you're answering the same set of questions multiple times under different circumstances. Or I'm giving you this electric shock measure multiple times. And so because you've already done it once, you kind of change how you do it the second time. So just the sheer fact of measuring you multiple times could lead you to change how you're responding in those situations. And then it could also be that the way that you've engaged with one stimulus is going to change and shape how you respond to the next stimulus. So if I've already had you play a violent game, maybe you're already really kind of excited and built up and anxious and your heart's racing. And so you're taking all of that high energy exposure experience into the next media that I'm having you engage with. So you're all jacked up after watching violent content, and you're then getting even more jacked up after playing violent content. Whereas if I had you only do one of those activities, you might not be quite as jacked up and excited and anxious and whatever it might be. So I might be interested in that, in the way that those things could go together, but it could also obscure what I'm interested in studying. So if I want to know the kind of unique effects of watching versus playing, if I put those in a sequence, I might have less clarity about what's causing what. So given these issues that come along with demand characteristics and order effects, I want to note two strategies that we can incorporate in a within subjects design that will help address some of these concerns that I potentially have with these sequences of activities. So the first one is what we call debriefing, and the second one is what we call counterbalancing. So debriefing is what we call something that we'll do at the end of a study, where I hate this phrase, but where we probe for suspicion by asking participants what they thought the study was investigating. So eventually, if you're concerned as the researcher that participants that are in my study might guess or infer what the study is about, one way you can look for that is to just ask them, once the study's over, hey, what do you think we were looking at in this study? What do you think our hypotheses were? What were we investigating? And so you might just kind of have a conversation after a study participant has played your video game or watched your movie. And the benefit here is that if you then hear from participants, hey, some of them kind of knew what was going on here, they guessed it, they were able to articulate to me what the study was about in a way that I would prefer maybe not to keep this person in the study, is that you can actually exclude these participants who have accurately guessed the purpose of your study. If in fact their lack of awareness is important for what you're studying, you could actually just exclude the data. So you wouldn't actually like kick them out of the study or boot them or not give them an incentive or not give them extra credit or whatever it might be. But you could just note these participants in your data file, and you could not analyze those participants when you run your analyses. And if it is a situation where you think demand characteristics are something to worry about, doing so, excluding these participants from analysis, would help eliminate or at least reduce the impact of those demand characteristics, assuming they've told you the truth during this debriefing session. So this is just one strategy for situations where you think participants guessing the purpose of the study could actually mess up the phenomenon you're studying, either because they're changing their behavior because they want to be more aligned or less aligned with what you think. This is one strategy for reducing those possibilities. Alternatively, counterbalancing is when we present a within subjects factor in different sequences across participants. So let's go back to our example that we were looking at before, where I might have some participants watch violent media and then play violent media. If I'm worried that the order in which they do these things might shape their response, so perhaps those who watch and then play violent media are going to be extra jacked up and extra anxious and extra stressed during that second media experience, I might want to just counterbalance what order participants do these activities. So I'm going to have some participants come in and actually play the violent media and then watch the violent media. And the important thing is that once I kind of average across these different experiences, any effective order should kind of wash out in my analyses. And I'll be able to distinguish, what is the unique effect of watching versus what is the unique effect of playing, controlling for, or in some cases ignoring then, the order in which they did these activities. Importantly, this design that I have here, we're still usually going to consider a one-factor experiment with two levels. I'm still, as the researcher, mostly just interested in what is the effect of watching versus playing, and I want to control the order in which they did these things, and I'm going to do that by counterbalancing. I'm going to have some participants do it in one order, other participants do it in another order, and I'll assume that in my analyses I can kind of ignore these potential order effects because they will have operated in potentially different strengths or ways across these two different groups of people. So I can then distill what's the unique effect of playing versus what's the unique effect of watching. In some cases, the researcher might actually be interested in these order effects, so they might have predictions about how order might matter. In those cases, we might have an additional factor we would be considering here. But for the purpose of this class, just to keep it simple, when a researcher is counterbalancing, we don't consider that a separate factor. We're still just interested in that main factor that I've manipulated. What is the effect of watching? What is the effect of playing? Controlling for, or counterbalancing, the order in which they've done these things. So just to summarize those key points that I mentioned there, in order to strengthen within subjects experiments, I might try debriefing. Debriefing is when I talk to participants at the end of the study and ask them what they thought the study was investigating. In those cases, I can then exclude participants who have guessed my hypotheses, reducing demand characteristics. I can also counterbalance by presenting my within subjects factors in different sequences across participants. We saw a really simple example in the previous slide where I just had 2 different orders. You can imagine for more complicated experiments, I might have 4, 6, 8, 16, 24 different orders, depending on just how many different things participants are doing in my study. So it can get kind of complicated. But in those cases, if I counterbalance appropriately, I can control for order effects and then kind of ignore potential order effects in my analyses. And in practice, whether you choose to have a between subjects or within subjects experimental design depends on a lot of things: the nature of your research question, the resources you have available, such as the time, money, and people to run the study and make sure it goes well and appropriately. And then just really feasibility is one of the keys. So like if you want to have people engage with 6 different messages, you need them to be willing to sit there and engage with 6 different messages and do your measure 6 times in a row, and then counterbalance those 6 messages across 30, 60, 90, 300 participants, however it might take. And so in some cases, you might just start getting a study that's too big or too complicated or too messy. And so you might want to reduce the number of levels that you have for these factors, reduce the number of factors, whatever it might be. All right, and so you have a reading this week, still digging into this topic of media violence and aggression. And this is going to be a really good example of a study that's using multiple factors and levels with different kinds of between subjects and within subjects factors. So as you're reading this study, I want you to try and take note of what are the factors and levels in this study. And more importantly, what determines whether something is or isn't a factor in a study. So we just looked at an example of counterbalancing, where we don't usually consider that a factor, where that's just something the researcher is including to control for potential order effects. We're going to have something slightly different in this study, and I want to see if you're able to pick up on it as you're reading, that they do have kind of an interesting thing they're doing with one of their factors in this study. And I want you to try and distinguish what are we kind of counting as a factor in a level, and what is something the researcher is just doing to try and control for potential alternative explanations in their study. So we'll dig into this a bit in lecture, but just keep an eye out for those things, and I'm curious to get your thoughts. All right, and so that is all we have for this particular lecture, but I think you can probably start to see how much more complicated and complex and potentially interesting we can make experimental designs when we think about them in terms of factors and levels. So as long as you're understanding the kind of definition of factors and levels, and you're also starting to grasp the advantages and disadvantages of between subjects versus within subjects designs, we're good to go. But we're going to keep seeing lots and lots of examples of these things in future weeks and in future studies. So we'll get a lot of practice with this moving forward.